Picture this. August 1971. A quiet Sunday morning in Palo Alto, California. Families are having breakfast. Church bells are ringing. Everything seems perfectly normal. But then police cars screech to a halt outside several houses across the neighborhood. Officers storm out, weapons drawn. They arrest young men, college students, right in front of their shocked families and neighbors. Charges: armed robbery, burglary. The arrested students are handcuffed, searched, and driven away in patrol cars while onlookers gape in confusion. Here's the thing, though. These young men hadn't committed any crimes. They had volunteered for a psychological experiment. What happened next would become one of the most controversial studies in the history of psychology. An experiment so disturbing that it had to be shut down after just 6 days. An experiment that would raise questions we're still trying to answer today. Are people inherently good or evil? Can anyone become a monster under the right circumstances? And how far is too far in the pursuit of scientific knowledge? This is the story of the Stanford Prison Experiment. And trust me, it's far stranger and more disturbing than you think. The setup. Let's rewind a bit. In the summer of 1971, a young psychology professor at Stanford University named Philip Zimbardo had an ambitious idea. He wanted to understand the psychology of prison life, why prisons were such brutal, dehumanizing places. Was it because cruel people became guards? Or was there something about the situation itself that turned ordinary people into oppressors? To find out, Zimbardo decided to create a fake prison in the basement of Stanford's psychology department. Now I know what you're thinking. A fake prison in a university basement. Sounds harmless enough, right? Just some role-playing. Maybe it gets a little awkward. Everyone goes home at the end of the day. But Zimbardo wanted realism. He wanted to see what would happen when people were truly immersed in the roles of prisoner and guard. So he went all in. He placed an advertisement in local newspapers. Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life. $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks. 75 young men responded. Zimbardo and his team carefully screened them, conducting interviews and psychological tests. They were looking for the most stable, healthy, average participants they could find. Anyone with a criminal record, psychological problems, or medical conditions was eliminated. In the end, they selected 24 young men, all college students, all middle class, all deemed emotionally stable and normal. They were randomly assigned to be either prisoners or guards. And here's where things get interesting. Zimbardo didn't just hand them costumes and tell them to pretend. He crafted an elaborate simulation designed to break down their real-world identities and force them to inhabit their new roles completely. The prisoners? They were arrested at their homes by actual Palo Alto police officers who had agreed to help make the experiment feel real. They were fingerprinted, blindfolded, stripped, deloused, and given numbers instead of names. They wore uncomfortable smock-like uniforms with their number on the chest and back. They had chains around their ankles. They were told to refer to themselves only by their numbers. The guards? They got khaki uniforms, wooden batons, mirrored sunglasses so the prisoners couldn't see their eyes. They were given almost total power over the prisoners and told to maintain order by any means necessary, except physical violence. The basement of Stanford's Jordan Hall was transformed into a prison. Cells were created from old laboratory rooms. A closet became the hole, solitary confinement. Zimbardo himself took on the role of prison superintendent, overseeing everything. On that Sunday morning in August, the experiment began. Everyone involved thought they understood what they were getting into. A 2-week psychological study, some controlled discomfort. An interesting story to tell. $15 a day, decent money in 1971. None of them could have predicted what was about to unfold. The descent. The first day was almost comical. The guards seemed uncertain, even embarrassed. The prisoners were cooperative, almost amused. Everyone was still themselves, just wearing different clothes and playing pretend. But by the second day, something shifted. The prisoners staged a rebellion. They ripped off their number tags, barricaded themselves in their cells using their beds, and mocked the guards. It was a minor act of defiance, really, almost playful. The guards' response was anything but playful. They called in reinforcements from the guards' day off. They got a fire extinguisher and blasted the prisoners with cold carbon dioxide through the bars. They broke into the cells, stripped the prisoners naked, took away their beds. They put the leaders of the rebellion into solitary confinement, that dark closet where they'd be left alone for hours. And then the guards did something clever, something cruel. They created a privilege cell. 3 prisoners who hadn't been involved in the rebellion were given back their uniforms and beds. They got to brush their teeth and wash. They were given special food while the others watched through the bars. After half a day, the guards switched it up. They took those privileges away from the good prisoners and gave them to some of the rebellious ones instead. The result? The prisoners stopped trusting each other. They began to suspect that some of them were informants. Solidarity crumbled. The guards had broken the rebellion without physical violence. They had used psychology, divide and conquer. And they'd done it on day 2. From there, things accelerated fast. The guards began waking the prisoners in the middle of the night for counts. Roll calls where the prisoners had to recite their numbers. These counts started lasting hours. Prisoners were forced to do push-ups, sometimes with a guard's foot on their back. They were made to clean toilets with their bare hands. Bathroom privileges became rewards to be earned. Some prisoners were forced to remain in their cells with buckets as toilets that wouldn't be emptied. The guards made prisoners sing songs, repeat humiliating phrases, perform degrading tasks. One guard earned the nickname John Wayne because of his especially cruel, swaggering demeanor. He would make prisoners do jumping jacks for hours. He invented creative punishments that seemed to amuse him. And here's what's truly unsettling. The guards didn't just follow orders. They innovated. They competed with each other to come up with new ways to assert their dominance. The night shift guards were particularly brutal because there were no researchers around to watch them. Meanwhile, the prisoners were breaking down. One prisoner, designated 8612, began suffering acute emotional disturbance after just 36 hours. He started crying uncontrollably. He became disorganized in his thinking. When Zimbardo and his team spoke to him, wondering if he was faking to get released, he seemed genuinely distressed. They released him after less than 2 days, but his breakdown had an unexpected effect on the other prisoners. They didn't see it as proof of how disturbing the situation had become. They saw him as weak. They called him a troublemaker who had gotten himself released while they had to stay and suffer. Another prisoner developed a psychosomatic rash all over his body. Another went on a hunger strike and was punished by being put in the hole for extended periods. The line between experiment and reality was dissolving. The participants weren't just playing roles anymore. They were living them. The point of no return. Now you might be wondering, where were the researchers? Where was Zimbardo? Why didn't anyone stop this? Here's the disturbing truth. They didn't stop it because they had become part of the simulation, too. Zimbardo wasn't observing the experiment from the outside anymore. He had become the superintendent of his prison. When prisoners asked to leave, he didn't see participants exercising their right to withdraw from a study. He saw inmates trying to con their way out. He denied their requests. He told them they had to stay. The research team had set up a parole board. When prisoners appeared before it, begging to be released, the board would sometimes deny them, even though they could have just let them walk out the door at any moment. Even though this wasn't a real prison, and there were no real crimes. One particularly chilling moment involved a Catholic priest who had been invited to the prison to meet with the inmates. Zimbardo introduced himself as the prison superintendent. The priest played along. When he spoke to the prisoners, he asked them about their charges and advised them to get lawyers. Some prisoners gave him their real phone numbers and asked him to call their families, as if they were in an actual prison and needed legal help. The experiment had become a shared delusion, but there was one person who saw it clearly: Christina Maslach. Maslach was a recent Stanford PhD graduate and Zimbardo's girlfriend. On day 5 of the experiment, she came to the basement to observe. It was her first visit. What she saw horrified her. She watched as guards lined up prisoners for a bathroom run, bags over their heads, feet chained, shuffling along. She saw the abuse, the degradation, the psychological torment. And she watched Zimbardo, the man she loved, standing there with a clipboard, taking notes, completely absorbed in his role as superintendent. That night, she confronted him. "What you're doing to those boys is terrible," she told him. She was in tears. How could he not see how unethical this had become? Zimbardo was defensive at first. He tried to argue. But Maslach's words shook something loose. For the first time since the experiment began, he stepped outside his role and saw what he had created. Out of the 50 or more people who had observed the experiment up to that point, fellow researchers, graduate students, university staff, Christina Maslach was the only one who had objected. The next morning, 6 days after it began, Zimbardo terminated the Stanford Prison Experiment. The 2-week study ended after less than a week because it had become too real, too dangerous, too devastating. The aftermath and controversy. In the immediate aftermath, Zimbardo brought all the participants together for debriefing sessions. The goal was to help them process what had happened and separate themselves from the roles they'd inhabited. Many of the former prisoners were angry. They felt traumatized by the experience. Some said it took weeks or months before they felt normal again. The guards had mixed reactions. Some seemed shocked by their own behavior. Others defended their actions, saying they were just following the rules of the experiment. One guard admitted he had modeled his behavior after a cruel character in the film Cool Hand Luke. He had been playing a role, he claimed, or had he? Zimbardo himself seemed shaken but also fascinated by what had occurred. He had set out to study how situations shape behavior, and boy, had he gotten his answer. He began presenting the findings at conferences. He wrote papers. The Stanford Prison Experiment became famous, a vivid demonstration of how quickly normal people could become abusive when placed in positions of power. The experiment became a staple of psychology textbooks. It was cited in discussions about Abu Ghraib and other cases of institutional abuse. Zimbardo went on to write a best-selling book called The Lucifer Effect, exploring the psychology of evil. The message seemed clear. We are all capable of becoming monsters under the right circumstances. The situation, not the individual, determines behavior. But here's where things get complicated. In recent years, serious questions have been raised about the Stanford Prison Experiment. Questions that challenge everything we thought we knew about it. Critics have pointed out that Zimbardo wasn't a neutral observer. He actively encouraged the guards to be tough. There are recordings of him instructing guards to create feelings of boredom, fear, and arbitrary control. This wasn't a naturalistic study of what happens in prison-like situations. It was a staged production where the director kept pushing for more drama. One of the guards, Dave Eschliman, the one nicknamed John Wayne for his cruelty, later admitted that he was deliberately acting, trying to make the experiment interesting. He wanted to give Zimbardo the results he seemed to want. Other guards have said they felt pressured to be harsh. And what about that famous breakdown of prisoner 8612? Journalist Ben Blum tracked him down decades later. The former prisoner, Douglas Corpy, said he had faked his emotional collapse because he wanted to leave and study for an exam. He was surprised his performance had been taken so seriously. Then there are the ethical problems that become more glaring in retrospect. Participants were told they could leave at any time, but when they tried, Zimbardo discouraged them. The line between voluntary participation and coercion got very blurred. The psychological harm inflicted was real, even if some of the behavior was performed. French researcher Thibault Le Texier spent years examining Zimbardo's archives and concluded that the experiment was more of a theatrical production than rigorous science. The sample size was tiny. There was no control group. The variables weren't properly isolated. The researchers were participants, and crucially, the outcome may have been coached rather than spontaneous. So what are we left with? The Stanford Prison Experiment has lost some of its scientific credibility. Many psychologists now consider it more of a cautionary tale about research ethics than a reliable study of human behavior. But that doesn't mean it's not important. In fact, the real lessons of the Stanford Prison Experiment might be different from what we originally thought. What it really means. See, here's the thing. Even if some of the behavior was exaggerated or performed, even if the setup was flawed, something real happened in that basement. Young men who had been screened for stability and empathy still inflicted psychological harm on other young men. Even if they were acting, even if they were encouraged, they did it. They came up with creative cruelties. They seemed, by many accounts, to enjoy their power. And the prisoners, whether their distress was fully genuine or partly performed, still experienced something traumatic enough that many of them were angry about it for years afterward. The experiment failed as objective science, but it succeeded as a demonstration of something else: how easy it is to create the conditions for abuse, give people roles, strip away individual identities, create a hierarchy, remove accountability, add some pressure from authority figures, and watch what happens. Does that mean we're all potential sadists? Not exactly. Modern psychology suggests a more nuanced view. We're not blank slates who will become whatever our situation demands, but we are social creatures, deeply influenced by context, roles, and authority. Most people have a range of possible behaviors, from kind to cruel, and which ones get expressed depends on the environment. The Stanford Prison Experiment, for all its flaws, showed how quickly an environment can be constructed to bring out the worst in people. It showed how institutions can corrupt, how authority can be abused, how easy it is for those in power to dehumanize those without it. And maybe most importantly, it showed how easy it is to lose perspective when you're inside a system, even when you're supposed to be studying that system objectively. Zimbardo became so absorbed in his role as superintendent that he couldn't see the ethical disaster unfolding around him. It took an outsider, someone who wasn't caught up in the performance, to break the spell. That pattern repeats in real prisons, in abusive institutions, in toxic workplaces, in corrupt organizations. People get so deep into their roles, so invested in the system, that they can't see what they've become or what they're enabling. The bigger picture. The questions raised by the Stanford Prison Experiment remain relevant, even if we reject its scientific validity. Why are prisons so brutal in so many countries? Why does institutional abuse occur so frequently in places like detention centers, psychiatric hospitals, nursing homes, military facilities? Why did American soldiers abuse prisoners at Abu Ghraib in ways that eerily mirrored what happened in Zimbardo's basement 30 years earlier? The answer isn't that some people are born evil, and it's not that situations completely override individual morality either. The answer is more complex. Humans are deeply social. We look to others for cues about what's normal and acceptable. We defer to authority. We adopt the roles we're assigned. We're capable of remarkable empathy and terrible cruelty, often in rapid succession. Institutions that lack transparency, accountability, and oversight create conditions where abuse can flourish. When people are treated as less than human, when they become numbers instead of names, categories instead of individuals, it becomes psychologically easier to harm them. The Stanford Prison Experiment was supposed to study this phenomenon. Instead, it became an example of it. Zimbardo set out to show how situations shape behavior. He ended up demonstrating how researchers themselves are not immune to the very forces they're studying. He became the superintendent of a prison he had created, complete with the same blindness to cruelty that characterizes real institutional abuse. There's something almost poetic about that. The experiment ate itself. Closing, so here we are more than 50 years later, still talking about what happened in that basement at Stanford. The experiment that was supposed to last 2 weeks lasted 6 days. The scientific study that was supposed to reveal profound truths about human nature may have been partly theater. The psychologist, who set out to expose the roots of institutional evil, ended up creating a small-scale version of it himself. It's messy, it's complicated, it's controversial. But maybe that's appropriate. Because human behavior is messy and complicated, we're not simple machines that predictably produce evil outputs when you feed them certain situational inputs. But we're also not purely rational moral agents who always resist corruption. We're somewhere in between, capable of both remarkable goodness and shocking cruelty, shaped by both our individual characters and our circumstances. The Stanford Prison Experiment failed as rigorous science, but it succeeded in starting a conversation that continues today. What kind of systems do we want to create? What kind of roles do we want to inhabit? How do we build institutions that bring out our better nature instead of our worst? And perhaps most urgently, how do we make sure we're not so deep inside our own prisons, literal or metaphorical, that we can't see when we've become the guards? Because that's the real horror of what happened at Stanford. Not that a few college students were cruel when given the chance. Not that a few others suffered psychological distress. The real horror is how ordinary it all was, how easily it happened, how many people watched and said nothing, until one person finally said, "This has to stop." Sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to break the spell. One voice saying this isn't right, this isn't normal, this has gone too far. Christina Maslach was that person in 1971. We all need to be that person in our own contexts, in our workplaces, our communities, our institutions. Because the lesson of the Stanford Prison Experiment isn't that we're all doomed to become monsters. It's that we all have the power to stop the monsters, including the ones we might become if we're willing to speak up. Thanks for watching.